Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to GCSP and welcome to this webinar on human shields. Some of you know the public event series Security in Law, a reality check. And this is exactly what we're going to do today, but just in a virtual manner. So basically, we're going to have an interactive discussion. And it's a pity to not see you all here in Geneva, but I think it's also a chance to do it virtually because we have now around 160 registered participants. So it's really a chance because 160 participants or guests we could not even host at GCSP because simply the floor, the building would not carry such weight. And it's also really a chance because we can have really literally global discussion today because we have colleagues from all over the place. We have guests today with us from South Korea, from Sri Lanka, from India, from Nigeria, Egypt, the US, Colombia, etc., etc., etc. So again, it's a pity to not see you here in Geneva, but it's also a chance and welcome very much today. So today's theme is human shields. And if you want, human shields is a very limited operational issue or scenario. It's a very minor issue of conflict. But it's really interesting because you have different dimensions at play. You have the operational question of how to reach your military and political objectives. You have legal questions, notably of IHL. You have questions of how to protect civilians. And overall, you have the ethical questions of how to use force and against whom. So it's really a world of its own where different dimensions of warfare or of conflict come together. But also, unfortunately, human shields is also not only interesting, but it's also relevant because there's a long story of human shields in conflicts, and unfortunately also it continues to be actually used in modern conflicts. And that's why today we're going to address the issues. And the issue of human shields, we're not just going to address it with anyone, but really two of the major thought leaders in this field, namely Neve Gordon and Nicola Perugini. Neve Gordon is Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Queen Mary University of London, and he has an impressive research achievements and is or was affiliated with very prestigious universities. Nicola Perogini is Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Edinburgh. And he also has done very impressive research, but also as for Neve, I'm not gonna read down the entire publications list and the long list of research interests, but really let Google do that for you. So thank you very much, Neve, and thank you very much, Nicola, for being with us here today and for taking time and engaging in the discussion. But coming back to the theme, why are we talking of human shields today, now? Well, it's very simple. It's because of the new book, Human Shields in the Line, a history of people in the line of fire. So the book that just came out, still warm, still coming out from press, that Neve Gordon and Nicola Perugini published this summer. Now, in terms of how we're going to proceed for this webinar is I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions to our distinguished authors and guests. And then the idea is really, as for any reality check, that you take over with the questions. Now, there's one technical issue, just to keep everything smooth. What we're going to do is I would kindly invite you to write your questions on the chat so that I can then pick them up and read them to our guests. This is a little bit not optimal because we would love to engage with seeing your faces and hearing your voices, etc. But just to keep everything smooth, also for technical reasons, we're just going to proceed like that. So please, again, please type your questions. Also during the discussions, please type your questions and we will do everything we can so that we can actively debate these questions. Because as I said, the goal is to be interactive. So with that, welcome again, welcome to everybody. Welcome to everybody around the world and welcome to Neve and Nicola. So let's dig in straight into the issue, because that, in the end, is why we are here. So Nicola, maybe just to have us all at the same point, at the same starting point, especially to be sure that we talk of the same thing when we use the same terms, well, what are human shields?
Well, thank you, Tobias, for having us, and thank you, Corinne and Domenica, for helping organizing the event. It's great to talk to a broad audience, also beyond academia, so thank you. What are human shields? Well, human shields, first of all, in a broad sense, are both a human and a weapon. So they are civilians or other people who the law protects, like prisoners of war, who are either forced or volunteer to shield a legitimate military target in order to deter the enemy from attacking the target itself. So human shields, in a broad sense, are, we could say, human weapons of deterrence. So in the 1977 additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions defines human shields in the following way, and I'm gonna read the definition very shortly so that we're all on the same page. And I quote: "The presence or movement of the civilian population or individual civilians shall not be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operations, in particular in attempts to shield military objectives from attacks or to shield, favor, or impede military operations," end quote. So we could say many things about this definition, but here I would like to limit myself to one crucial issue. So here we can see clearly that the law operates through an avowal and a disavowal of the protected status of the people who become human shields, civilians or prisoners of war. So the law here avows the protected status of human shields by basically doing what? Rendering it legal to use civilians or prisoners of war as shields. But it also disavows this protected status by asserting that human shields are not able and will not render an area immune from an attack, thus suggesting that at the end of the day, human shields, these civilians or prisoners of war who are used as a shield, can be killed. So what I'm trying to say is that while the law, while outlawing the use of human shields, the law allows in certain circumstances to kill them. And this is the kind of paradox that is able to generate a series of legal, ethical, and political dilemmas, to also to build on what you were saying at the beginning, Tobias, some of which we hope we can discuss with you today.
Great point. Thank you very much, Nicola, for setting the scene, but also already developing your analysis and your argument. Maybe then the second question would be, well, how should the warring party react when confronted by enemy combatants who hide behind civilians? No, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. So maybe a step back instead of just, if we know what human shields are, well, what different types of shields do we encounter in war zones? Because Nicola, what you described was like one scenario, one situation. Neve, what do you think about that?
Well, when we began looking at this project, we were aware of two kinds of shields. Experts usually talk about involuntary shields and voluntary shields. An involuntary shield is usually a civilian or a prisoner of war that is coerced or forced to serve as a shield. There was a very famous image circulating on social media a year or two ago of a Kashmiri citizen tied to a military jeep. As the military jeep patrolled for 5 hours different villages, the soldiers tied him to the jeep, supposedly so people would not throw stones at the jeep. We know that the Israeli military has used Palestinians to walk in front of them again in order to make sure there's no booby traps and so forth. Many militaries do it, and many non-state actors like Daesh or ISIS that uses civilians to protect its convoys as it's fleeing towns. The second kind is the voluntary shield. It is the kind of anti-war activist that volunteers to shield a site, and it does. The voluntary shield will do it in a non-violent way. It's a non-violent act during war, and it's also an act in the sense that the civilian who becomes a voluntary shield is active, while the laws of war usually imagine the civilian as passive. But then what happened is, while we were writing the book, we did a study over the years 2015 and 2016 of major newspapers around the world, and the instances they mention human shields. And we found, I think, well over 1,000 articles, or maybe several thousand. I don't remember the number, but I do remember that if we looked at all the number of human shields that all these articles mentioned, it was over 3 million human shields. Sometimes it's the same incident and several articles are discussing it. And then we looked, who are these shields, or what type of shields are these 3 million? And out of the 3 million shields, only 0.2 of a single percent were voluntary shields. 5% were the involuntary shield. And then came the question, who are the 95%? Okay, because 95% of the shielding accusations during that year were neither voluntary or involuntary. And these are what some experts and what we call proximate shields. Now, the proximate shields are people that are cast as human shields because, or not because someone coerced them to become a human shield, and not because they volunteered to become a human shield. And initially we thought these are people that are trapped in war zones. And we were looking at the time at Mosul. This was 2016, and suddenly there were press releases that ISIS is holding human shields in Mosul. It began with the Pope coming out with a press release saying 200 young men and boys are being held as human shields. And then he was running for presidency, then Trump said a few hundred, and then some more. The New York Times said 10,000. And suddenly the United Nations came out with a press release notifying the public that ISIS is holding over 100,000 civilians as human shields in Mosul. Now, we know from reading reports that ISIS was using human shield in a brutal way. But the fact that there were only several hundred militants in Mosul, and that these militants were blamed for holding 100,000 civilians as human shields, it didn't sound right to us. And then we started looking into it more closely, and we realized there's an anomaly here. And the way it became very clear to us is that we decided we're going to look at the articles that described the ISIS attack on Mosul in 2014. So we have more or less a mirror situation. We have 2016, it's clear what's going on. But 2014, ISIS is coming towards the city, there's a few hundred Iraqi soldiers, again, in the city, protecting the city. And no one's blaming them for using human shields as they protect the city. We looked at other instances where government forces were inside urban spaces and were being attacked from outside by non-government, non-state actors, and there was no mention of human shields. And then we understood that the proximate shields is proximity, not like what we thought in the beginning, proximity to to war zone, being trapped in the midst of a war, but it is proximity to non-state actors. So if we look at the newspapers that are describing Hamas launching articles on Tel Aviv, where Israel's central command is right in the center of the city, and let's say it injures or kills civilians, Hamas is going to be blamed for killing or injuring Israeli civilians. But when Israel targets Gaza City, where Hamas's central command is also in the city, and targets the central command in Gaza City, and civilians are killed, these civilians are hardly ever framed as civilians, but they're framed as human shields. In other words, if Hamas kills civilians, it is to blame for killing innocent lives. And if Israel kills Palestinian civilians, then Hamas is also to blame, this time for holding them as human shields. So that's more or less the three types.
Thank you very much. I mean, there are a lot of things popping up, but I think maybe to keep it a little bit simple, at least at this stage, or to break it down to something very practical or clear, is then the question that I asked before, a little bit ahead of myself. Well, from an operational military point of view, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to react? What measures are going to take? What are you going to do when enemies or enemy combatants use human shields? And also, you talked of these three different distinctions of involuntary shield, voluntary shields, which is already, if I got it right from the percentages, more than involuntary, which is also very interesting. And then the 95% of proxies and the blame game. Maybe we can keep that out and to later the question of the blame and how you want to play with that or use that against your opponent. But really now, just from a very practical military point of view, how should the warring party react? Maybe Nicola.
Well, that's a very tricky question, of course, like all operational questions. That has to do with also what Neve was trying to do with these distinctions. So let's consider the distinctions in order to answer this question. So, as Neve was mentioning, in most cases, high-tech militaries tend to cast civilians who are trapped near non-state militants as proximate shields. So these civilians do not volunteer to become shields or are even coerced to be shields. So they are framed as shields, and this is crucial. This act of framing is crucial because it constitutes a linguistic act of war. So one point that we try to make in the book is that the way in which we discursively frame violence cannot be separated from the way in which we perpetrate it. So one way, basically, to answer your question is that, as we said, in most cases, about 95% of the cases, the dilemma has nothing to do with acts of human shielding, but rather with how civilians and civilian spaces, because we're talking about cities, are framed and named. So what military and legal experts are really asking when they highlight this moral dilemma involving human shielding is whether a warring party should bomb a city full of civilians in order to de-incentivize militants from hiding in that very space of the city. what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that I'm fearful that the shielding accusation is basically being used to what? To justify blanket bombings of urban spaces and the resulting civilian casualties. What I'm saying is that civilians are framed as human shields in order to be killed as human shields. What I'm saying is that let me use these words, the production and destruction of human shields in a way coincide. In a similar vein, we know that often when belligerents, for instance, bomb hospitals, they deceitfully claim that the hospital was being used to shield militants. So the shielding accusation has become also a common excuse for striking protected people and sites. But then, of course, you might press me with your question and ask, what about those cases in which warring parties actually force people to become human shields, as the cases that Neve has mentioned in his answer? What about all the instances in which ISIS is really using human shields in Syria and Iraq? What about the instances in which the Indian or the Israeli or another military use human shields? What about Hamas using human shields in certain circumstances? I think that there is quite ample evidence of many non-state and state warring parties forcing civilians to become shields. So what do? I think that in general, militaries should refrain from bombing targets protected by human shields. First, the argument that killing the shields would de-incentivize militants from using them is not based on any empirical evidence. There is no clear empirical evidence of that claim. And ironically, the same people and the same actors who are advancing the de-incentivize argument and recommending basically to bomb sites protected by civilians use as shields are the same actors which are accusing Hamas, ISIS, and other militants not to protect civilians. So there is a paradox here. You accuse your enemy of being barbaric for not protecting civilians, but then you're arguing in favor of bombing areas, civilian areas, because there are human shields. Then there is the other type of shields we were talking about and Neve was referring to, which is voluntary human shields. So what to do, how to react to situations in which there are voluntary human shields, so people who volunteer to protect. Well, first, I would like to ask myself, do we really want to kill people who are using non-violent means of defense in war? Second, as we show in our book, in the majority of the cases, voluntary human shields protect civilian targets, and this is crucial. So warring parties should not be striking the targets that most voluntary shields protect, because they would strike civilians. They are not military targets. It's hard to deal with that situation. Finally, with respect to human shields, when we target voluntary human shields, we convey the message that non-violence does not work, which is not a message that I'm ready to convey or promulgate, not least among my enemies.
Great. There's a lot of arguments, a lot of analysis, a lot of empirics or lack of empirics. So a lot, I think, for us to proceed. But you were talking of framing And I think also Neve already you mentioned, well, or even Nicola, you started with the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocol and definitions, and that maybe if international law is not the source, the whole question is regulated and addressed by international law. Now, you know, you can always say, okay, those who drafted those provisions just simply got it wrong. Maybe you can say, you know, the opposite of good is having good intentions. So nice try, but no. But if we're not going there yet to answer that question, what does this teach then about international law? What do human shields teach us about the operation of international law? And if it's binary, but maybe does it facilitate then the use of violence against civilians, or does it actually really prevent? Because I think even if they might not have gotten it right, I imagine that the intention to prohibit, explicitly prohibit human shields was, of course, to prevent the use of force, to prevent violence against civilians. So if you look at that legal connotation, how do you see that? And maybe Neve.
Thank you, Tobias. You know, the great Jewish thinker Maimonides once said that the gates of interpretation are always open, and I think that's tells us a lot about the law. I think it was Duncan Kennedy, the famous Harvard professor, said once, talked about legal work, and for him, legal work was the work of interpreting the law, and so. Clearly, the attention of the laws of war was to regulate violence and, if possible, to limit it, to restrict it. But then we have to ask ourselves not only what the intention was, but what do the laws of war do? And I think the laws of war are extremely malleable, and I think they are open and even lend themselves to numerous interpretation, and they can just be easily used to limit violence as to, or just easily used to facilitate violence as to limit violence. And one of the claims in our book is that if we take this marginal and controversial figure, this figure that is both a human and a weapon, and use it as a kind of lens to look at the laws of war, to examine them and to analyze them through different instances. And we begin with the American Civil War, and we go to the Boer War in South Africa, and we go to the Franco-German War and the World Wars, the Vietnam War, we go to Ethiopia, we even go to the Black Lives Matter protests now and to computer games. We look at all these instances, but when we look at the instances where the laws of war is relevant, what we find is that often the laws of war have helped certain warring parties facilitate and even enhance their violence. So the claim, for example, that I mentioned earlier, that ISIS is holding 100,000 civilians in Mosul as human shields, is both a descriptive claim that we can judge as either true or false. Either they are holding 100,000 human shields or they're not. That's a descriptive claim. But we argue that when the claim about human shields is uttered, it's also a speech act, in the sense that it already determines what the warring parties can do. So if the Iraqi military, backed by the United States, is preparing the assault outside of Mosul, and suddenly the city is framed as being constituted by or comprised by ISIS militants and human shields, and there are no civilians there, but only human shields and ISIS militants, then the repertoires of violence that the law permits to use in attacking the city can be more lethal. And so legally, once the human shield is kind of asserted on a certain situation, it allows, and the law lends itself to allow more lethal mechanisms of violence. So what we found in our research is that the accusation of human shielding is often a legal strategy used to justify the use of lethal repertoires of violence against civilian sites and populations. And it reveals much about what can be done and not be done with the law.
Very interesting. I think like to come back on that, but maybe just to keep a certain trajectory. But then what can we do about these challenges? I think, Nicola, you've mentioned 2 or 3 times the word paradox. I'm a fan of the word dilemma because you can only choose between 2 bad options. Neve, you now approach it and say that we have a fundamental issue that use or abuse, but the way that you frame things or the way that you interpret the law, and the gates are always open for interpretation, that gives us, again, a lot of, it kind of, it's a bit like COVID in a sense. It leaves us a bit lost with what we have, but we don't know how to go further. So maybe, Nicola, then do you see anything how these challenges could be addressed, or how to move forward?
It's a huge question, but yeah, let me try to be less paradoxical. So I believe that there are things that we can do in order to address some of the failings of the laws of war that Neve was mentioning. But in order to really address the difficulties we are witnessing, and to really address the roots of the problem, we need a much broader political effort. So let me try to explain the first point with an example. So I previously mentioned the case of hospitals, which are bombed because they are non-state groups are accused to shield behind these medical facilities. So for several years, on average, every day and a half, a hospital was bombed in the Middle East. And often the human shielding accusation was mobilized and deployed in order to justify the destruction of this medical facilities. So what we have witnessed basically is, that's why it's striking, different political regimes, Syria, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Israel, to name a few, have used what Neve and I have called the so-called hospital shield argument. So they have done so because of what Neve was trying to explain, that the laws of war, on the one hand, prohibit the bombing of those medical facilities and of those hospitals, but yet, on the other hand, the law also provides a series of exceptions that allow the warring parties to bomb them. So shielding combatants and arms are among these exceptions. So what to do? In the case of hospital bombings, we believe that the solution is relatively straightforward. We should reform international law and prohibit the bombing of hospitals without exceptions. So we have recently advanced this argument in an article in the European Journal of International Law. maintaining that it is urgent to introduce a total ban on bombing hospitals, not unlike the kind of ban that we have on torture or rape during war. But, and here I go to the second point, to the broader political effort. Reforming the law is not enough, not least because many of the difficulties arise from the kind of asymmetric power relations in the international political arena. For instance, human shielding and the human shielding accusation have proliferated with the so-called war on terror. This is what we show in the book. And therefore, without challenging the war on terror, one cannot really, and its paradigm, one cannot really address the challenges you are referring to. We know that instead of defeating terrorism, this war has created the conditions for terrorism to proliferate. The war that was launched also to protect civilians from terrorism has put the lives of millions of civilians at risk, much more than they were before the war was launched. So let's face the contradiction. The war on terror has become an act of terror. Hence, I think that the only way to better address the challenge, to answer your question, is to reshape a little bit our political imagination. We are in a cul-de-sac, and the only way to exit this cul-de-sac is to put an end to the war on terror. So we have to organize and create an international political front and coalition for the end of the war on terror. If, and here I'll finish, if we want to prevent terror, we need to stop terrorizing in the name of the war on terror. So that's the kind of political effort which I think is required to address your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I see I really expected a very short, or not short, but very specific, very tactical, very concrete and measurable solution. But of course, I think what your answer highlights is it's more complex, but also it's more general and it's more intertwined in the global context and actually to what we do in the big theme and not just at the tactical level. At this point, we have already 2 questions, and I would warmly invite everyone else also to just type. I'll just read them so we can continue to discuss, and please, to the audience, please just type. As usual, there's no right, there's no wrong. We even heard that even human shields, when we think that something, it works like this, maybe it's actually the opposite. So this also applies to questions. Smart questions can be not that smart, and not that smart can be smart, and anyway, it doesn't matter. So please just tap whatever comes to your mind. But maybe we have 2 questions, and I'm just going to read it aloud so that everyone gets a sense of it. I'm just going to do one after another because both are very, very informed. Maybe both questions take us a little bit a step back. So back from the war on terror, back from the geopolitical or the geostrategic aspects or the strategic ones. And maybe we're gonna, and one is more about the law itself and one less. So maybe we're gonna start just with one that is not about the law. And the question from Bandulo Kopipili is really related to the intent of having human shields. And here we're talking of human shields used by non-state actors. So basically the comment of saying the intent is to guard themselves against the attacks from the governmental military forces, to launch attacks against government military forces, and to use, and this is the framing aspect, to use as propaganda if civilians are hurt and wounded due to attacks. So the question, basically, the consequence is that, so one way or the other, armed non-state actors will exploit the human shields for their advantage. This is my interpretation, but or my reading or my thinking, probably because they will gain concrete advantages out of this. So unless we really have, there will be advantages coming out of that. So really the question is, where and how do you draw the line to then still select legitimate targets behind human shields or not?
Yes. Do you want to take it, Nicola, or do you want me to take it?
Yeah, no, I can take it. I
Okay.
can be. Well, it's a very fascinating question. No? So how there are no more legitimate military targets. But again, looking at the question itself, the question is asked as if automatically non-state actors are the ones gaining from hiding or a military target behind civilians. So again, we continue to ask the question from the point of view of a sovereign state actor that is legitimate, that has always legitimate military targets. So why don't we ask the same question? Let's take the drone wars. Drones are operated in the midst of cities. So why don't we ask ourselves that question? Why? Where do we draw the line in that case between a civilian and a legitimate military target? We are talking of situations in which both state and non-state actors are blurring. Maybe that's the nature of war itself. There is a constantly blurred distinction between the two, which is manipulated, which is used, which is exploited by different actors in order to make sense of the violence they use. But the problem is that we continue to ask that question precisely, constantly from the point of view of a state actor, framing the non-state actors as the bad guys. And as we say in the book, in order to understand that kind of rationale, we need to historicize it. And what we do in the book is precisely to show how this idea, so how to deal with the bad, perfidious non-state actors, has a long genealogy and history that goes back to colonial histories and to history, and to colonial wars, and to wars in which what you have is constantly the sovereign against the non-sovereign. So again, maybe I didn't provide an answer to that question, but I think it's important to think what is behind that question, why we ask that question in that way.
Well, I'll just add one tad addition, is that usually when the accusation, the claim is that human shields is the weapon of the weak. And Nicola was referring to that, and that the weak uses it against high-tech states. What we do is we turn that on its head, and we show that human shields can be the weapon of the strong, of legitimizing violent acts against civilians by the strong. So they blame the weak for using human shield when the weak is not always using them.
It's great, Neve. Thank you very much also for Nicola. Thank you for these precisions and for developing your thoughts. Now, I think exactly what you're saying now, Neve, with reversing the blame or reversing who is doing the wrong leads to the question that our Lazari asks to you, referring to what you developed about the operation of international law. And his suggestion is, he sees it, our Lazari sees that if there are not two issues here actually, which have to be separated. And so on the one hand, the first is a general claim that IHL, or the law of armed conflict, actually limits violence, but also facilitates violence. And that's really a design feature of the law. And this we might like, or we may not like. That's how it is. But if in any case it is deliberate. And then there's the second aspect. And the second aspect is that the belligerents abuse the law, including the misframing or the framing or misframing a situation as one involving human shields. And so the primary problem in the second situation is actually not in the law, but it's with the abuse. And the question really, would you agree with that?
Not exactly. I think we can, the way I think what I would say is that we cannot approach the law without interpretation. The example I give my students is that in the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, following the French Revolution, one of the central rights is the right to property. So the Declaration, the law says every person has a right to property. That's what the law says. That's it. Now, we can understand it that this cup of coffee is mine. That's what it means. I have a right to this cup of coffee. But other people understood the same thing, the right to property, as a right to employment, right? So that people can have property, they must be employed. Now, is this interpretation right and is this interpretation wrong? I don't know. And the way it is determined that the first interpretation was right, that this is my cup of coffee, and not that everyone should be employed and everyone should have property, is about dominant, who are the dominant actors of interpreting the law, okay? And so what we have, I agree with the person that asked the question, that clearly belligerents often try to kind of abuse the interpretation so the law would favor their actions. And I agree with the person that asked the question that not every interpretation goes. But I'll give you an example of an interpretation that might go. So we have a patient, a combatant patient in a hospital. And the combatant patient in the hospital uses their cell phone to call another combatant in his unit. And then the hospital is bombed. And the bomber says they were planning something. This is what's going on, and the hospital was shielding a belligerent act. And it becomes very complicated because the law has the exceptions, has numerous exceptions that allow for the bombing of hospitals that are shielding. And so if it were just this binary, it would be simple, but I think it's a bit more complex than this binary situation. But I see where the question is coming from. Nicola.
Yeah, can I add something? So it's a problem of interpretation of the law and the constitution itself of the law. There is a moment in history, the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, in which the human shielding clause is debated. And there is a discussion about the legitimacy or not of certain kind of anti-colonial self-determination movements and the means that they use. And they used in order to decolonize themselves. And so what you have immediately after 1977 is some additional protections to the kind of means of warfare that anti-colonial movements can use. And you have an official recognition of the status of these movements and of these armed groups. So there is a moment in which the law, which was previously unbalanced, becomes a little bit more balanced. And that's the moment in which, for instance, Ronald Reagan and other administrations decide not to ratify the protocol, one of the protocols, the additional protocol 1, because precisely a shift had changed not in the interpretation of the law, but in the structure of the law itself. So again, to reiterate with an historical example what Neve was saying, it's both. It's the interpretation and the constitution and transformation of the law.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for both insights. I would like to monopolize, of course, the discussion and just go where I would like to go in my questions. But honestly, we're really, it's not about me, it's about all that are here. And so kindly thank you everyone also to all the questions already. And maybe just to go further with one more, there is Juliette Wiegmann, who really likes the analogy or the analysis, and I'm sorry if I didn't hear or listen carefully enough which one it was, about the Black Lives Matter movement. And she says that it's very interesting to hear about this matter in a non-war setting. I think, Neve, you mentioned it. Would you mind further elaborating on where you see parallels or contradictions or links or influences or manifestations?
Sure. So we've been seeing since the murder of George Floyd and the eruption of Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, we've been seeing the proliferation of instances of human shielding in the United States. And usually what we see is white citizens standing in front of Black citizens or citizens of color and protecting them from police violence. It's an act of what is called voluntary human shielding. It reached kind of a zenith point in Portland, Oregon, where a group of moms gathered together and created a human chain, white moms gathered to create a human chain and use both their privilege as white people and as motherhood in order to protect the Black Lives Matter protests before them. We saw it much earlier. We saw it in Standing Rock, where 2,000 U.S. vets went to Standing Rock to protect the Native Americans that were trapped there or not trapped, but were there in a freezing cold weather, and where the security forces shot at them rubber bullets and sprayed them with gas and so forth. So what we see is how different warfare strategies adopted by civilians in war zones are now entering into the civil sphere, and one of the reasons for this is that the police forces, particularly in the United States, but not only, are being militarized. So many police departments have Humvees, have helicopters, some even have tanks in the United States. And the way they're responding to these protests are maybe not as violent as warfare, but is very violent. And suddenly we see the emergence of these kind of black-white solidarity and standing in front of the protesters. I will only add, and then I'll end, is that it also, these acts also point to another paradox of human shielding, a paradox that was first discussed by our colleague Banu Bargu, who basically pointed out that voluntary shielding exposes the hierarchy because they use a certain social, racial, ethnic hierarchy, because the white body is more privileged and has more value than the black body, and therefore can protect it. But at the same time that it exposes it and uses this privilege in a courageous manner to protect the lives of black protester, it also reasserts this hierarchy and reifies it, and by saying, hey, my body is worth more and I can protect. And so there's it doesn't undo necessarily the white supremacist hierarchy that it tries to defy and dismantle. So there's this paradox, and that comes up very clearly now in the Black Lives Matter protests.
Just to add a small thing, this is something very similar to what happens in war zones. So in the book we deal, for instance, with the case of other voluntary shields who go to war zones, or Rachel Curry, who was killed as a human shield in Palestine. And what we're trying to say also with this critique of the kind of the hierarchy is not an indictment of voluntary human shields. I mean, human shields themselves are conscious of the kind of privilege that they are mobilizing in this specific context in which there are civilians who count less than white civilians, or in contexts like the one that Neve was referring to.
Thank you very much. If I got the math right, we have another 4 questions. Agani asks 2 questions, but if I may say, I think that the second question was already at least partially addressed by Neve in response to Aurasari's question. So really a new angle saying that, well, the use of human shields in the discourse, one is in the public discourse, another is in the diplomatic speech, but the precise question, if you are aware of any attempts, successful or not, by state actors before legal or judicial bodies such as the International Court, the International Criminal Court, to justify the killing through the human shields discourse. So basically, do you see that in a legal mechanism or legal forum actually being addressed or used as such, not just public, not just diplomatic?
Well, I'll take it, and then maybe Neve can add. There is a case in which the human shield accusation was not mobilized, but what happened was basically that the discussion over the killing of certain civilians who were framed as shields was prevented. So that case is the ex-Yugoslavia and Kosovo. So during the Kosovo War, the international coalition basically killed several civilians and Kosovar civilians who were framed as refugee used as human shields by the Serbs. Those killings, those incidents were denounced by several human rights and organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And what we have done in a specific chapter on ex-Yugoslavia was precisely to analyze the documents that were used and that were produced in the framework of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And what one notices is that whereas on the one hand, accusations of using human shields are repeatedly mobilized against the Serbs in order to justify the violence that was used in the war, on those instances in which Kosovo civilians were killed and in which NATO repeatedly in several NATO spokespersons framed as human shields, those cases were progressively cancelled and erased from the legal discussions and the legal debate. So to answer the question, in that forum, in that legal forum, what happened was not the mobilization of human shields in order to justify violence, but it was human shields helped not to discuss at all civilian casualties. And then the other question was, the other case is the case of Israel-Palestine, in which, again, the question of human shielding doesn't even arrive to court. I mean, there will be discussions about human shields probably at the ICC, but the problem is that in that case, still what happened in those situations that Israel framed as human shielding situations and in which civilians were killed cannot be discussed legally because still Palestine is not recognized as a legitimate political actor. So again, it's 2 cases in which the discussion didn't even get to the details of those situations that were framed as human shielding. So maybe Neve has something to add.
I mean, another case is the Sri Lanka Civil War, where 300,000 citizens were moved to safe zones, and then anywhere between 10 and 40,000 civilians were killed. And so the United Nations comes out with a report condemning both the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. And the way the Sri Lankan government responds to this report, and many human rights lawyers help it, is by claiming that, yes, we killed 10 to 40,000 citizens, but they were human shields. They were being forced to be human shields by them. So it does appear, it might not get to court, but it does appear in many governmental reports as a response to why they have killed civilians.
Great, thank you very much. And maybe switching a little bit, another point that you had mentioned previously was the asymmetry of forces or asymmetrical conflict. So the question there from Pamela Dean is really with the high-tech military, and you mentioned and touched upon it. Do you have a sense, having done your analysis and the historical analysis too, is there a sense of, did the high-tech military bring more or less civil casualties, at least in the cases and the situations that you had analyzed? So it's a double-edged sword. How do you see it? Is it just a double-edged sword, or does it lean in the one direction or the other?
I mean, I think it's fairly clear that the high-tech militaries kill more civilians than the barbaric forces, in the sense that just if we do the number counts. So I think the Syrian regime, allied by the Russian military, or if we look at what the United States has done over the years in Afghanistan and in Iraq, or if we look at what's going on in Yemen today, I think there's created a different kind of dynamic, but the idea that wars are moving to these precision weapons and that civilians are not dying is not really the case. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have died over the past 2 decades, probably more. And most of these civilians are killed through these kind of aerial assaults, which are carried out by high-tech militaries. So I'm not sure I understood the question, but if that's the question, then yes, it's
I think the question had also to do with hospitals.
No, but that's by someone else. That's a different question.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that leads to the question about the hospitals and Aldea Rossi, who asks if you're saying really you should outlaw the attacks or targeting of hospitals altogether, if that actually couldn't have the unintended effect or consequence that the total protection would actually induce the fighting party to actually exploit that protection even more.
Well, if I can take it very briefly, the way in which the law is structured now is unbalanced in a certain direction. What we argue is not to delete and erase the prohibition of using human shields. But the way in which the law is structured now is that human shielding is prohibited, and there are certain exceptions that allow for the bombing. What we are saying is, let's create some balance, because the law structurally is totally, completely in favor of those actors which during the recent years have justified the bombing of hundreds of medical facilities and sites using that argument. So what we are arguing again is a rebalancing of the kind of unbalanced nature and structure of the law.
Right, but I think the question is, wouldn't a total ban incentivize the militants to use hospitals as a kind of shield? And so we respond to that in the book and say two or three things. One is, we don't know. What we do know, because the de-incentivize and incentivize, there's no empirical data that can tell us that. But what we do know is that already every day and a half, a hospital is being bombed. So what, they're going to bomb a hospital? I don't understand it. And the law allows that. So we have to change the law first and then check whether that incentivizes these actors to use hospitals as shields. We really do not. What is clear today is the law is riddled with exceptions that can be used in order to justify the bombing of hospitals, and that has to be changed.
Great. We're going back to the technical aspects. Hafia Juadi, who has worked in Eastern DRC, and there were oftentimes clashes between militaries and rebels and civilians, were oftentimes in the front line. The question really of if civilians work for the rebels in the services they work for the rebels, but they're not themselves combatants. Are they considered human shields or accomplices?
I can take it, Neve, if you want. That's a terrific question, because it gets to a crucial point of the book. We have a chapter on Maoist guerrilla and the Vietnam War, when Mao's ideas started traveling in anti-imperial and anti-colonial settings. Mao's theory was clear. The people and the warriors are one thing. The revolution is going to be one if the two components stay together and fight together. Civilians and combatants are both part of the same effort, and it doesn't even make sense to trace that distinction. That kind of line of reasoning started traveling in anti-colonial settings, and it allowed anti-colonial movements to organize also politically and not just military, and support the war effort with the complicity, to use the word used by Shafia, of civilians. So that's, and then in the book we discover, okay, but why at a certain historical moment that collaboration is outlawed with the codification of the human shield clause, whereas in other contexts, like our partisan war in Italy or other partisan wars in national liberation wars, that indistinction between civilians, partisans, and other combatants was not outlawed and was not considered to be illegitimate and illegal. So what I'm trying to say is that it's tricky to trace the distinction, and in the moment in which the category of human shield is mobilized, the question and is immediately shifted toward an attempt to outlaw a certain kind of political military effort. So I don't have a clear answer about how to consider those civilians, but I think that the fact that we ask ourselves that question precisely connects with this unsettling issue of how to consider civilians who want to contribute to a war effort by, or actively supporting the war effort from a military point of view, or organizing politically in order to protect and, let me use the word, shield a certain kind of political project.
Thank you very much. Great. There is another reaction from our Asari concerning your answer to his question before, and really says that, you know, the question that you raise is, you know, regarding the exceptions, if and the general rule, if the exceptions actually in the law that relate to human shields swallow up the rule, so basically it's a structural problem, or whether the law in the end is still worth saving and can be reduced or can be saved by reducing the gray areas of interpretation and thereby actually limiting its abuse. So really the thinking beyond and how with the existing legal mechanism that or certain issues that you raise could be addressed, but really just as a general thought. But I think that delves well into, that leads well into Marianne Lawrence a question, who really likes the idea of how the discourse transforms the notion of civilians into human shields and therefore justifies forcible military action. And then really the question, I think this is a bit empirical or leads to empirics. Do you find in your research, are there any type of states or situations where these where the use of human shields is most likely to happen? So basically, what are the conditions for it to happen, or for it not to happen? When does it not happen? And also, do you see common patterns in when, where, or how states go about this?
Maybe I'll take this, but maybe let me begin by saying two words about the book. Because the book is made up of 22 chapters, which is a lot of chapters for a book. But what we did is we wrote them relatively short, like magazine articles. And we tried, so each one begins with a vignette of human shielding throughout the history, this 150 years history from the American Civil War until today, and as I mentioned before, with civil protest and environmental shielding, Greenpeace, different movements in South Asia used environmental shielding, computer, and so each one begins with a vignette, and it's written in what we hope to be as an accessible language as possible, of a kind of showing how this marginal figure really is all around us all the time throughout this history, and we hope the listeners will find it interesting. Now, and so that gave us a chance to look at who's using this shielding argument lately, and in the past maybe 2 decades or since the war on terror was launched. We see that the accusation is coming primarily from those launching the war on terror against their enemies. And often it is in cases, or almost always, it's in cases where the high-tech military that's launching the war on terror has killed civilians. And so that's when there's this pattern going on, that's what allowed us to kind of infer the claims that we've made before. So we see a proliferation with the war on terror of the accusation, and we receive a Google alert every day of news articles that mention the term human shields. We see it very clearly of Israel blaming Hezbollah or Hamas of human shielding. We see We see it when the Americans target in Yemen or in Afghanistan or in Iraq cases of human shielding. And so another thing we suddenly noticed is that it often happens in the ex-colonies. So when there was a campaign between Ukraine and Russia, and it starts parallel to the war in Yemen. They're starting at around the same time. In the beginning, it was about the same amount of people were being killed, the same amount of civilians were being killed. In Ukraine, there's 2-3 articles mention human shielding. In Yemen, there was a plethora of articles mentioning human shielding. So the colonized civilian, the ex-colonized, because the civilians in the colony did not have rights until the additional protocols. And suddenly they become fully human. So one of the claims, I'm just going on but one of the claims of the book is that the history of human shielding is also the history of who is considered human. So these people in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, who during colonialization were not considered fully human, suddenly become fully human with the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocol. And suddenly they receive protections. But now, suddenly with the war on terror, they are reframed and recast as human shields in order to take away some of the protections that the law gave them with the additional protocols.
Thank you very much. And Nicola, if you're not reacting, then I would say we delve into our last question. And here again, there's the exception to the rule, which please don't abuse, but no. If there are still any more remaining questions, please just type in. Otherwise, this would be the last question from Bandula Godibibli. And I think there are actually 3 questions, but the first one was partially addressed, and the second 2 we can put together. Really, the question of were there any situations or were there effective strategies that were used or employed to prevent opportunities to put up or use human shields. But now this is my question. If you're saying that there's a structural cause to it, that the stronger accuse the weaker, basically, to use human shields, but is it still possible that, you mentioned the United States and other states, stronger states, or warring parties, is it still possible that they do not actually use human shields for some reason or some other reason? And we're not, maybe we're talking of discourse, maybe their media is not, the victims in general don't have that well of help in the media, or not that loud of a voice, but is it possible that they simply do not do it because of some preventive strategies or decisions, etc.? But again, I think this would just lead into the other question of, were there situations where there were effective strategies for prevention?
So I'm going to take the first and try to answer the second, and maybe Neve wants to do the same briefly. What stage or under what circumstances belligerents have used human shields? There are situations of asymmetry in which the use of human shields are used more frequently. There are situations in which there is a siege in the American Civil War, and the weak actor is deploying certain kind of prisoners of war as human shield explicitly in order to use it as a deterrent. There are situations like, and this works in certain cases. There are situations, we mentioned the war in the ex-Yugoslavia, in which UN soldiers were put by the Serbs in certain areas with military depot or military targets, and that helped to prevent the bombing of those areas. Are there ways of preventing that opportunity? It's a huge question, and again, I think that we go back to your final question, Tobias. What are the solutions? And I think one of the solutions would be probably to reduce or avoid war in civilian areas. Maybe it's irreversible, but if we continue to fight in those areas, there is no way to prevent human shielding or situations that can be framed as human shielding. And then to another great question, which is yours, Tobias, why they don't? Why certain actors don't? Well, first of all, war has changed. Those actors, the majority of the actors we are talking about, don't fight in a battlefield. They have a pilot with a joystick in Texas, and they're bombing using a very complex apparatus, certain areas thousands of miles far from them. There is no way for them to even enter the very conditions of human shielding. But in spite of that, they use human shields in a way. If we stick to the definition, they put deliberately people who kill with a joystick in the midst of civilian areas. So still, they could be accused of human shielding from a certain point of view. And the second thing is also a certain, why they don't has to do with this kind of crucial point that we try to make throughout the book, that war is about demonstrating that you are, and the laws of war are about the struggle for the definition of who is the humane and inhumane actor in the battlefield. And I think that those actors try to put all their efforts in order to frame, to define, to speak about their violence in such a way that can be perceived as humane. So these two elements have to do with why they don't, I think. I'll leave it to Neve.
I'll just relate. I think there was a question before that we didn't relate to is, okay, if the law is so problematic, do we need the law? Someone asked, I think. And I think definitely we need the law. I wouldn't want to throw the law away. But we need to start thinking beyond the law. We need to start thinking, and I think Nicola gestured towards it in many of his answers. We need to start thinking of targeting some of the law targets here some certain symptoms, the conduct of war, but it doesn't target war itself. It doesn't target violence itself. And we need to think of the processes that are leading towards the war, both in the international arena, but also in the corporate arena, in the production arena. We need to look at the production process of war. We need to look at the relations and the undemocratic relations of the international arena and the asymmetric power relations that produce war. We need to look not only at the law will not set us free. That's my point. The law is not going to be the solution. It doesn't mean we need to throw it away. We need it, but it is not the solution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your thoughts, for your critical insights, and really for sharing this with us. I think I'll refrain from summarizing or from generalizing or even just a simple resume it, because I think the topic is too complex, and there are also too many different technical issues, but also too many perspectives that can be taken, and also assumptions, and then you link it with empirics. So I think what I want to say is I'm going to refrain from resuming the talk, but I think this is actually also very purposeful, because I think if you, especially dear guests, your participants, if you're a bit confused, that's a good thing. If you're stimulated, that's a good thing. If you're questioning your assumptions, I think that's a good thing. And I think it's especially, we have talked about the insights and findings from the book, but I would really then really recommend to take the book and delve in to these questions, and also continue to engage with the topic and with the fundamental questions that, as we see, are quite even structural or political at the global level. Maybe, but still to just give those who really put a lot of effort into this, that continue to put a lot of effort and heart and sweat and into this. Maybe if I may still just ask you, Neve and Nicola, maybe just a last word. If there's something that you think didn't come up enough, knowing that we're all going to take your book and we're now going to read it, and we're going to read what you wrote, and we're going to read it with our eyes, but is there anything, just like a last word, both of you, before then closing up this webinar?
I'm not sure.
I can say that, for example, in the computer games, what we found is that so we have computer games that children play, millions, hundreds of millions play every day. And these new computer games are really, really quite amazing in what they do. And similar games are played by the militaries as simulation. Okay, so militaries are training using similar games, and our children at home are playing with them, doing homeschooling in a sense, because as Nicola mentioned, much of the war that is already fought and future wars are going to be fought through joysticks. Now, when we look at human shields in these computer games, what we find is that it is a tactic that should be used. So if my child is playing a computer game, it's one of the features that the child should use to protect him or herself while fighting against the enemies in the computer game. And so we see how, first of all, how the civil and military are entering our living rooms and our children's rooms through the computer games. And we see how the messages about human shielding are contradictory. They're telling us that the enemy uses human shields and it's barbaric, and yet the corporations that are creating these games that are being sold to our children and to our militaries, it's telling them, hey, human shielding is a possible feature if it protects you. So I just want to whet the appetite of the book. These are the kind of things we're dealing with.
Maybe I can add one final word on the same line. We deal also with environmental shielding. There is a war on the environment, and there are people who decided to shield against the war on the environment. And so that's a very fascinating and interesting trajectory that we explore through the history of Greenpeace and other movements which have mobilized the body in order to protect the nature, and they have been successful. So when you start the book, be prepared for chilling story, but also successful stories of human shielding.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much also for your last thoughts. And to me, what just resonates is the question of protection, which, at least if we're not all, at least we're connected to Geneva. I'm currently sitting in Geneva, and the term protection is very loaded, but very positively loaded. And I think this also inspires me to more critically reflect on what we mean when we're saying of protection of civilians or protection of other protected persons, and what do we really achieve when we take those measures or use that language or legal concepts, etc. So thank you so much, really thank you so much for taking us on your journey. You did the work, we were just consumers. We just reap the benefits of your work. So thank you very much for this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being in here. I saw the fluctuation in terms of participants that joined and that left, and honestly, it's pretty good. We didn't lose so many people on the way, which I think is really, really positive. So really, thank you very much for your engagement. Thank you for your interest. I'm pretty sure both Nicola and Neve both will continue working on this. GCSP will try also to continue working on this. So you will continue to hear from us, and really we invite you to also go on that journey, take it serious, be critical, be open, and really thank you so much for being here. I really mean now in the sense of have a good evening, or a good afternoon, or a great or nice morning wherever you're sitting. But the most important thing in these times, now we're really focused on one issue that is important, but the context is still like really stay safe, stay healthy, take care, and we hope to see you again. So thank you very much for being with us. And yeah, as I said,
thank you,
bye.
Tobias, for making it happen.
Thank you.